Hello and welcome to the German Marshall Fund's program on AI governance and accountability. We're thrilled to have you. I'm Karen Kornblue. I'm the managing director of the German Marshall Fund's technology program, GMF Digital. And we have a star-studded group here today to talk about that very topic. As debates about AI are raging in the news in the halls of Congress, NTIA, the mighty Commerce Department agency that serves as the president's principal advisor on technological advancement, actually has a structured process underway already. In April, it asked for comment on an AI accountability policy. And we're having this discussion as the period for comments comes to a close in just a few days. So it's a very timely discussion. And just to put it in context, there are a number of executive branch actions already underway. There are 2 executive orders requiring federal agencies to develop regulatory plans and another requiring agencies to address civil rights risks. The Office of Science and Technology Policy issued an AI Bill of Rights. NIST has a voluntary risk management framework. The Federal Trade Commission has committed to applying existing laws. And then Congress is putting out a variety of proposals, including just yesterday, Senators Hawley and Blumenthal put out some ideas for licensing, liability, dealing with privacy and kids. There's a proposal for a new agency, for other kinds of guardrails. So we're having this conversation in a very rich context. And our panelists are exactly the people we want to hear from and educate us about all these issues. Ellen Goodman is the Senior Advisor for Algorithmic Justice at NTIA. She's also a Distinguished Professor of Law at Rutgers School of Law and co-founder of the Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Law, as well as a former visiting senior fellow at GMF. Miriam Vogel is President and CEO of Equal AI. She's also the chair of the National AI Advisory Committee. Rashida Richardson is senior counsel at MasterCard, where she leads AI policy for North America. She recently served as an attorney advisor to the FTC chair and as a senior policy advisor at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Sarah Myers West is managing director of the AI Now Institute and recently served as a senior advisor on AI at the FTC. We're going to have a discussion and then we'll open it up to the audience. You can use the Q&A function to ask questions. We'll turn to those after our initial discussion. So I'm just going to ask one question of the panel members and then ask you each to address it and sort of lay your main points on the table. So everyone's going to take about 3 minutes. And just a general question. Generative AI models have focused public attention on the importance of AI's social and economic impacts. How are you assessing the conversation right now, especially around governance and accountability? And why don't I ask, Ellen, why don't you lead us off?
Sure, it's great to be here. Thanks, Karen. And I'm really interested to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. I guess, right now there's a raging debate about sort of existential threat and long-term catastrophic risks of generative AI on the one hand, and then there's another part of that debate which is urging us to look at present risks and present harms. And in our view, both of those conversations are really worth having, and they're actually connected. And they're connected in the following ways. I think generative AI, as you said, has really focused public attention and sort of burst on the scene, but some of the risks and the harms and the governance requirements and sort of pressures on our governance structures have been here since algorithmic systems really have been become quite common, over the last 10 or 12 years. And I'll identify a couple of ways that is. What we learned from ChatGPT and other generative AI systems is that what the training data, what is in the training data comes out in the outputs, and that can be bias, that can be misuse of intellectual property, or at least use of copyrighted materials that puts a lot of pressure on creators, artists, musicians. Explainability is an issue. The systems that put out the companies that put out these systems really can't explain how they work. And that's not just true of generative AI, but of many algorithmic systems. They can be misused. They are being misused. They can be properly used, but that can create harms, both systemically in terms of their effects on labor and on social cohesion, on marginalized communities in all sorts of ways. They present value chain problems. Who is responsible when a system is created, whether it's generative AI or another kind of AI system, and it's deployed out in the world? Is it the deployer or the developer who has responsibility? And so I will stop there and just say that from our perspective, from NTIA's perspective, what we're looking at doing is sort of identifying the need for policy development. However, policymakers, regulators, self-regulators come and try to address some of these problems. We're asking whether they have the tools, whether the ecosystem is sort of strong enough to provide mechanisms that have been identified as important, such as audits of the systems, assessments of the systems. You mentioned licensing and certification. So we're looking at some of the plumbing that has to be in place for any of those risk mitigation and harm prevention measures to work. I'll stop there.
Great. Why don't I turn to Miriam?
Thank you, Karen, for having me. And Ellen, it's great to hear your thoughts on this. I'll look forward to hearing much more, as well as Rashida and Sarah. I think it's really encouraging to hear the work that Ellen's talking about, because we have this interplay right now. On the one hand, if we want AI adoption, if we want to take advantage of the efficiencies that AI has to offer, we need to build trust. On the other hand, we need those systems to deserve our trust. And we have a lot of work to do on both of those sides of the house right now. At Equal AI, we talk a lot about having good AI hygiene. I think right now there's so much curiosity about AI itself and the power. What I think people don't realize is we're very similar to where we were with cybersecurity 15 years ago, where everyone thought it was someone else's problem. AI governance is the responsibility of any company that's adopting AI, particularly if they're using it in pivotal ways. And if a company doesn't think they are, then talk to your HR team, because you probably are. And so I think it's really a time for us all to think about what is our role, because we each have a role to play, whether it's a consumer who has a question to ask about what am I using and how is it using me and what's really happening under the hood now. We have the right and responsibility to ask those questions, as well as the elevated responsibilities of those within the senior executive capacity within companies who have a unique perspective. We certainly need regulation. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, there already is a lot of laws on the books in the US and across the globe that are applicable to AI. So AI is regulated. There will be more, there should be more. And it's really exciting to see the work of NTIA, the important framework that NIST put out that we certainly rely on at Equal AI. But we each have a role to play, particularly within the organizations, not just companies, but organizations using AI, because at the end of the day, it will require us to look under our own hoods and understand, does this system deserve our trust?
That's great. I love the analogy. We need so many analogies for AI to get our hands around what we're facing, but the analogy to cybersecurity is really helpful. Rashida, can you give us your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. And I think before diving into answering your question, it may be a little helpful to explain what MasterCard even does in relation to this topic. So MasterCard is a global technology company in the payments industry that is committed to responsible development and use of AI. We develop and employ AI-powered products and solutions to make everyday finances easier. This could include commerce activities from shopping, traveling, running a business, or managing your finances. And our goal is to make it easier, more secure, and more efficient for everyone. And to that end, we believe innovation with AI should have a positive impact on society and bring benefits to individuals. And I'm happy to explore more about how we advance this goal during our discussion. But as far as governance, we support efforts that can help forge global consensus along policy principles, specific standards, and regulatory approaches.
Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what the previous three speakers have said about this being a really important moment for taking a really long and hard look about what kinds of accountability we need to be most effectively addressing, this, moment of a lot of excitement, but also a lot of anxiety about the effects of artificial intelligence. And importantly, that AI is not something new, but it's already in wide deployment and affecting people's lives and their access to resources in the present day. And so if there's one thing that I would really want to advocate that we do in the current moment, actually two. One is, I think it's really, really key that we take an approach that foregrounds, an emphasis that regulatory friction is effective. It has an important role to play in shaping the future trajectory of artificial intelligence. There is not anything that's sort of inevitable about the future of artificial intelligence. And then secondly, I think, learning the lessons of the, sort of move fast, break things era of big tech, we're in another moment where companies are essentially experimenting in the wild with the deployment of systems often before they're ready, often before they're even profitable. And so in developing accountability frameworks, I think it's really key that we look at where the burden is placed for seeking accountability. And I think that the appropriate place for that burden to be placed is on the companies to be adequately validating and trying to mitigate harms before they're unleashed into the world, rather than under-resourced actors.
Great. I want to return to that which Miriam also raised. But Ellen, why don't we kick off this Q&A part by you talking a little bit more about the NTIA, what you're asking for comments on, and maybe helping the audience that may want to prepare some comments, focus in on what the key questions are, what you're hoping to add to the discussion and where you're really hoping to get some thoughts.
Sure. So we take as our starting point that as Miriam said, there already is AI regulation that is, general sectoral laws in the U.S. That apply. So if there is discrimination in hiring, it applies whether or not it was an AI tool was used to reach that result. As an example, obviously the FDA regulates software as medical devices. So there are many existing laws that already apply. There's also increasingly specialized AI law coming out of the states and the cities. And so we've observed that, and cybersecurity is a great sort of example, an analogy here. And so is privacy. And so in the same way that there hasn't been federal privacy law and there's been a lot of action in the States and in Europe, we're sort of maybe seeing the same thing beginning to develop here. And so we started to see this policy development. As I mentioned, audits are being required. In some cases, pre-release certification, Sarah used the term validation, is being considered and developed. And so where we come in is what we're asking for comment on is, how we should think about these mechanisms. What needs to happen in the ecosystem to make them useful for both the public and also, not too costly for companies. And so we think about the big tech companies, but we also want to be mindful that there are a lot of new entrants and there's a lot of exciting economic opportunities here. And we sort of want an accountability system that is rigorous enough to prevent harm and to earn our trust, and also kind of accessible enough that it doesn't impose barriers to entry. So and we can get in later if we have more time to sort of the baskets of questions we're asking. I'll just highlight a couple. With respect to algorithmic or AI audits, we're asking questions about should those be standardized? Should the audit, should there be an audit profession that's professionalized, that looks a bit like the financial auditing community? Should they be auditing to particular standards? Usually the answer is yes, but then how do we deal with certain kinds of attributes of trustworthy AI that really aren't amenable to standard setting? How do we conduct audits then? And then finally, we ask a bunch of questions about how does, to Sarah's point about who bears the burden and the costs of conducting validation, it's really expensive to audit these systems. Who pays for that? How do we sort of prime the pump in a socio-technical, because these systems are socio-technical, we need not just technical expertise, but also context-dependent sort of social expertise. How do we build teams of auditors? And so I'll stop there, and we ask sort of clusters of questions like that about a number of different accountability mechanisms.
Great. I wish Miriam and Sarah, you both brought up sort of the externalities and who should make sure that these systems are trustworthy. And Miriam, with the analogy to cybersecurity, I wonder if you could each unpack that a little bit and talk a little bit about what you're thinking about. Miriam, do you want to kick it off?
Certainly. I think in terms of making sure I'm answering the right question, the balance of regulation and internal oversight.
Yeah. And just the fact that you said that everybody thinks it's somebody else's problem, but it really should be the company's problem. Well, how do we solve that problem? Is it regulation? Is it standardization? Is there, what can be done?
Yes. The answer is yes. I think the other piece that's coming that I'm hoping companies are prepared for is the liability, the legal liability outside of the regulatory liability. So we've had a bunch of administrative agencies in the US and elsewhere who've stepped up and said, from the FTC, I think 4 years ago, they started talking about if you're advertising using AI, make sure that your claims are legitimate, because otherwise you're under our purview, even if you think you're not. If you're not telling creditors the basis for the rejection or why they're not getting as advantageous a loan or opportunity as some others, you're under our purview. We've seen EEOC and DOJ have a joint historic statement last year saying civil rights laws are under our purview, whether you're using AI tool or not. And by the way, you're thinking about certain have you thought about the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, so that if your voice recognition system, which will be likely rife with bias because all the reports have demonstrated they just are not up to speed in terms of hearing males versus female, let alone different intonations, let alone if you have a speech impediment. So you would thereby be in violation of the ADA. We've had a joint historic statement more recently with the FTC, EEOC, DOJ, and CFPB. It's very exciting that government's stepping up. We're seeing it, and I can't wait to hear more from Ellen on the NTIA piece. But government is stepping up. NIST provided this framework that, it blows my mind because, I've been working in government for decades. I haven't seen a document that's been as well received from the broadest cross-section of stakeholders as that document. There's so much more work to do, but we're fortunate that government has stepped up and provided so much of the framework and starting points that we need. But at the end of the day, the reason I talked about cybersecurity is because it's internal facing. There's a lot of reasons why companies need to do the work to make sure their AI that they're using is deserving of the trust, like we talked about. First of all, it's their bottom line. If they do not have the trust of consumers, they don't have a business. On top of that, in addition to the regulatory agencies who have stepped up and said that they're looking out and trying to provide guidance as well as oversight, there's going to be, I'm convinced, we've seen an uptick, and I know we'll see a lot more at Equal AI. For about 5 years, we've been monitoring the litigation space in the US and elsewhere. I think consumer protection laws will be used more broadly. Basic contract law, if you have a material breach, if you harm people, if you discriminate through the AI that you've provided, that you're using, you're going to be liable. Now, who particularly is going to be liable is somewhat remains to be seen, and obviously will be use case specific, but those laws are on the books. Those are at the fingertips of lawyers currently. And so I think it's in every best interest of every organization using AI in a pivotal way to make sure, even ahead of the regulatory landscape that's forthcoming, are we in compliance with regulatory laws on the books, as well as the litigation that is going to be increasingly coming, as well as just basically wanting to deserve the trust of the broader public and our consumers.
So Sarah, just picking up on that, do you think that sort of pre-market certification or licensing is needed? And if so, for which kinds of systems, and how would you think about the criteria?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this makes the very careful crafting of questions in the NTIA's request for comment, I think, really useful, because the category of artificial intelligence is so broad, so vague, so all-encompassing. And the state of the field is very varied depending on what type of system you're talking about. So broadly speaking, AI, I think the science fiction writer Ted Chiang recently described it as applied statistics, which is my new favorite way of discussing what artificial intelligence is. But the very quick trajectory of the field has been to move to larger and larger scale construction of AI models, where there's, a lot of work to develop products that are on the smaller scale, but using a model that's been trained by one of the bigger companies that has more access to large pools of data, large amounts of compute power. This sort of like messy state of affairs means that the question of who bears responsibility is really complex. The big players are, involved in, building products that are used out on the market. They're also operating marketplaces on which AI systems are sold. They're also operating infrastructures that, other companies are reliant on while they're building AI. So what this means is, I think, a key question for AI accountability is, what are the kinds of documentation and evaluation metrics that we need to even, be able to effectively evaluate these systems? That's one. And then two, who's responsible for what at each moment, at each point within the supply chain of development and deployment of AI systems, and having that broad and encompassing frame that also allows for specificity in, benchmarking, where certain types of technology like facial recognition is much more mature in, having, consensus around benchmarking. Other spaces, very much like generative AI, are much more nascent, and what benchmarking needs to look like is, very much in open discussion. So a lot of complicated questions to be looking at here. But I think, a key point is, being careful to use language that accurately describes the type of system, the point in system deployment that we're talking about, and that attends to the material reality of how these systems are being used out into the world.
So Rashida, when you hear all this, you're here working for a company. What does the business community, or MasterCard specifically, what do you need from policy to help advance AI accountability?
Yeah, so as a global company, MasterCard develops and employs AI-powered solutions to connect individuals, businesses, and organizations in more than 210 countries and territories. So policymakers across the globe are trying to tackle issues on AI accountability, and we're actively engaged in those discussions on a local level. But since this conversation is focused more domestically, I'll focus my remarks on what we want to see from US policymakers. And at a high level, we support harmonization of the current patchwork of AI-related laws that Ellen referred to earlier. clarifying consumer expectations nationally, and ensuring consistency and legal certainty regarding existing legal frameworks, which I've heard my other panelists refer to as well. We believe policymakers can look to these existing laws that can already address potential AI harms to consumers in technology agnostic ways, such as civil rights laws, fair lending, and consumer protection laws. And these laws can ensure that not only critical protections survive no matter how the technology evolves, but it can also provide companies legal certainty for the practices and procedures that we already designed to comply with these frameworks. And to the extent that an AI-specific law is proposed, it should be a principle-based framework that provides flexibility as AI evolves. We know that there have been some calls for principle-based approaches that push against the adoption of any bright line rules, and that's very not much our intention here. Rather, we want to advance this type of approach, and we believe policymakers should explore some of the following considerations as future frameworks are developed. And some of those considerations include guidance interpreting how public-facing AI accountability products, such as consumer notices or disclosures, may align or conflict with existing consumer disclosure requirements across sectors and legal jurisdictions in order to reduce consumer information overload. We also support guidance interpreting how existing legal authorities apply to AI bias concerns and how organizations can explore AI bias mitigation without legal risk. And in particular, the business community could benefit from guidance on how to identify and mitigate proxy bias, since that's a fairly novel challenge posed by this emerging technology. And finally, the business community could benefit from guidance on how to translate AI assessments or audits relating to normative values such as safety, fairness, or privacy in order to aid consistent interpretations and resolve conflicting definitions due to varying legal frameworks.
So I want to just get a few more issues on the table before we turn to the audience. Ellen, I want to go back to you and talk to you about American leadership. There's this fear that I hear coming from especially the West Coast that regulators are just going to put on the brakes, and America's competing with China. It's going to hurt our leadership. It's going to hurt our innovation. We're not going to get all the benefits of AI. How do you think about balancing those?
America wins when democratic values are advanced and when safety is protected. And I think, like, we might have imagined a conversation like that about pharmaceutical safety, right? And people like to get their pharmaceuticals from U.S. companies, not from other companies that don't ensure safety and that can't be trusted. So I think there's a way. I mean, it's of course a reasonable and important concern that regulation and even self-regulatory sort of practices are promote innovation, but also, and I think it was Miriam maybe who said this at the beginning. And by the way, we should also talk about Miriam's experience with NIAC because there definitely overlaps between that work and our work. These systems have to earn trust, and earning trust and being innovative in a productive way are completely consistent. So bottom line is, I think, American leadership in tech, in AI benefits from trustworthy AI advancements.
And let me just push on that a little bit, because those folks who may be listening, who come from the business community, who just hear regulation and think it means top-down government calling the shots. Like, how are your proposals really allowing for innovation to happen at the same time as you're trying to increase trust?
Yeah, I think some of the things we heard from Rashida about, the business community's interest in having kind of harmonization and clear definitions, which Rashida in her academic capacity has really advanced some of the definitional work around AI and algorithmic systems. I think, what else? Some of the things she said about needing kind of assistance with understanding proxy bias, also, and I think Miriam and Sarah may have more to say about this, but one of the things we ask about is, to the extent that we want everyone doing evaluation, and even, and the NIST risk management framework calls for it has been so widely embraced. And it calls for measuring and mitigating risk through very specific kind of playbook. But a lot of entities don't have the data sets that they need in order to conduct that testing. And so, I think one way in which a kind of coordinated governance regime that made data sets available, synthetic data that was privacy protected, is actually a way to advance trustworthy AI and also advance business interests. And I guess the last thing I would say is, remember, businesses are on all sides of this, right? They're consumers of these systems that have to be able to trust, that really want them to work without bias and harm, and want to have assurance that they're working well as the developers of the tech, have interest in trustworthy AI. So I guess there's a way to tell this story where innovation in business is on one side and regulation is on the other, but there's another way to tell the story. And I think we've told that story in cybersecurity and in privacy, where they work hand in hand.
Great. Miriam, Ellen brought up NIAC, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. And, you've mentioned it already, but what kinds of accountability tools you think, based on that experience, agencies need to enforce existing laws, but also to help Congress. And then maybe if you could throw in, because I don't know if I'll be able to get back to you before we open it up, if you have time, maybe talk a little bit about Equal AI.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try and pack it all in as quickly as possible so we get to the question most importantly. So what is NIAC? It is the National AI Advisory Committee. It was created by Congress with the mandate of advising the President and the White House AI Initiative Office on AI policy generally. They also noted several areas of particular topic interest that they wanted us to comment on. And so as a result, for our first year, we launched last May, and a year ago, May, and where are we? Yeah, a year ago, May. And we spent the first year doing a lot of the work in working groups and coming together as a committee for sessions that are public and online. So those are all available. I highly recommend, for anyone wanting to learn about certain areas we talked about, in October of last year, we hosted our second public meeting and invited expert speakers on a broad variety of topics that we were interested in digging into further. And so those are still online, and I find them so rich with insights. And we'll look forward to doing more of that in year two. But for year one, we broke out, as I said, into the 5 working groups based on those areas noted in the statute. So trustworthy AI, which was a lens throughout each of our working groups, but for year one, wanted to have a specific working group focused squarely on that. We had international collaboration and AI development. We had R&D. We had competitiveness, and that was really, there was about 6 times in the statute where they mentioned the National AI Initiative Office and preparedness within government and the White House to regulate on AI. And so that's where that working group was, as well as workforce. So you'll see in year two some reconfiguration. Trustworthy AI remains a lens in each of our working groups, but is not a specific working group of itself. For a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk about, but really it was so squarely the focus of all of our working groups. We just wanted to integrate it and call it what it was. Similarly, inclusivity is a key variation, a key element of all of our work. And so inclusion is part of our year two working groups, one specifically, but again, as a thread. And there are some leaders who are taking ownership on ensuring that all of our working groups are thinking about inclusivity, as well as rights, the rights of users of AI. So those are common themes that are demarcated by certain working groups, as well as common themes. Other working groups for year two include generative AI, again, workforce, work and workforce, actually, specifically, future of science, and several other topics of great interest, international collaboration again, as well. So our first year report is public. It is on NIAC.gov. We are still, because, we are formed out of government, they're all the government processes that that we get to learn about for those who were less familiar. And so we are waiting on the public statement, the press release, to formally start talking about it, but it is public and you all can see the work that we aligned on. It's a consensus report and we had a conversation about it. You can hear where the members stood on each of the topic areas at our last meeting in April. And so you'll see much more of that in year two. I'm hoping we'll have more convening. So reach out if there are areas that you all think that we should use this committee of 26 experts to amplify voices, as well as the public nature of our committee to help. What we really want to do is bring more people into the tent, understand what is AI, what is responsible AI, what's my role in it, where do I begin, as well as what are the pieces I need to understand to be a responsible actor in using it. So that's the NIAC piece. The tools that we recommend, I don't know that there are tools specifically from NIAC, so I'll say from the Equal AI hat that I wear, tools are a key element. I think before you think about tools, you need to think about the framework. What framework are you going to operate under as an organization? What is going to be your approach? I mean, every organization has its values. So you have to first align and say, if you're using AI, which you probably are or will be soon in some way, how does the AI that we're using support our principles and not impede them? Because they will if you're not intentional and you don't have the framework. And then when you have your framework in place, and frameworks, luckily, we have many good ones to choose from. So many companies have their AI frameworks and principles that are publicly online that you can learn from. We at Equal AI always look at the NIST AI risk management framework. And in fact, another tool we created to help companies and organizations navigate and make even more good use of the principles and the great tools provided within the broad NIST framework is we have an impact assessment tool on our website. If you go to equalai.org, right on there, you'll see an impact assessment tool, which we think is really one of the best practices. And for a company to use the guidance from the NIST framework, we made that the heart of what we did with the impact assessment tool. So it's really not something we can take credit for with that impact assessment tool. It's looking at particularly the user guide that they published they released alongside the NIST framework, and it helps you assess your AI no matter what vertical you're in or what stage you're in. If you're developing it, if you're using, licensing, deploying, it's helping you take accountability in the way that the NIST framework requires. And there are many other tools out there, but thank you for asking about Equal AI. So that's one that we use with the companies and organizations we work with. There are many more out there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And Sarah, I just want to go back to you, and you talked, and I think Ellen talked as well about this socio-technical systems, and NIST talks about it. And I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit for folks. What do we mean by that? And how can risk mitigation take the socio-technical aspects into account? I think, Rashida, you talked about this as well. Talk a little bit about that, what it means and what the implications are, both for the company side and also on the government side.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on this. I think it's what's really key to take away from that thread of discussion is that, AI systems, all technical systems don't exist, in a vacuum. They're not in isolation. They can't be examined in isolation. And, in one of the sort of early waves of work trying to address bias and discrimination surfacing in AI systems, the focus was very much on a narrow technical definition of bias and on corrections that essentially applied statistical analysis to try and fix it within the system or within the underlying data. And I think where the movement in the policy and government space is towards an acknowledgement that these systems that are being used out in the world, and that we need to thus account for the social dynamics, the political and economic dynamics that are shaping the conditions of deployment, who's served by these systems, who benefits in ways that might be, that may be discriminatory, who's harmed in ways that might be discriminatory. And that sort of like broader accounting is, I think, what the socio-technical analysis aims to address. And I think in particular, it's important that an analysis of power be brought into those discussions too. Who is it that carries power in the deployment of these systems? Where are there power asymmetries that might be served by them? If the goal is accountability, I think that power analysis is a really key component of being able to effectively get there.
It just strikes me that this problem is so multi-sided. We're going to be having this discussion for a long time to come. Rashida, I know you've looked at this from the different sides in your career, but as you think about the ecosystem and you think about being at a company in this ecosystem, how do you see your role and the company's role in the ecosystem? And what do you think some opportunities are? And then to circle back to the NTIA comments, I wonder if you can highlight, what some of your comments will be to NTIA.
Yeah, so this is actually a good follow-up to the socio-technical discussion. We tend to take a human-centric approach to AI that aligns with our data responsibility principles, which include principles like advancing and upholding best-in-class security and privacy practices, being deliberate in how we use data and technologies like AI in order to minimize bias, inaccuracies, and unintended consequences. Our data responsibility principles guide the design, development, and application of all data-driven technologies at MasterCard, especially AI. They're embodied in how we operationalize our robust AI governance and privacy by design framework, which includes AI accountability tools such as impact assessments, which is highlighted in the NTIA questions and overview. As a digital leader in the payment ecosystem, we keep data ethics at the heart of this approach to innovation, because MasterCard welcomes efforts made by government and other world leaders to develop normative frameworks that ensure trustworthy AI benefits people and society. And this is an important result because we believe it can be achieved through active engagement and partnerships with industry, civil society, and governments. And I think to just answer your question of what is my lens on all of this, given I've sort of traveled through all the spaces, I do think there are more opportunities for those types of partnerships that I just mentioned. And it's often a common misperception that the business community is either not interested or not interested or wants limited engagements, or those engagements aren't meaningful. But I found through my experience across these different sectors that hasn't been the case. At MasterCard, there's great interest in these types of partnerships and engagement across sectors, but also when I led technology policy efforts during my time in civil society, it often involved multi-stakeholder coalitions that included industry advocates and academics, along with impacted communities. And I think those types of multi-stakeholder engagements are not only important for understanding lessons learned, but I think it can help us figure out the right balance that Ellen kind of described up front, in that there's sort of a push and pull in order to allow for innovation, but also to help the business community understand what are the guardrails or constraints we need to operationalize within.
Great. I think we've dispelled two myths so far. One is that it's sort of business and innovation against government, because I just hearing from each of you, both have you crossed over in your own careers, but also how rich this discussion is across silos, but also if anybody doubts that folks that are working in and around government have the sophistication to think about these issues, I think after watching this panel, they will not have that fear any longer. We are a transatlantic entity, German Marshall Fund of the US, and we've had a very US-centric conversation. And Sabine from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, who's a very thoughtful observer of all this, wants to know if any of us have any thoughts about the EU's AI Act and how that will shape U.S. approaches, or if there's any dialogue cross-fertilization. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I have some thoughts. I think we've mentioned harmonization a few times, and I think there's a very active dialogue right now between the Europeans and the U.S. government, the TTC process. The OECD is kind of a bridge between Europe and the U.S. and the other Western countries that are trying to advance trustworthy AI with a democratic flavor. And so I guess I would say there's a lot of interest. I think that you can see coming out of the administration's work in trying to harmonize as much as possible what happens on in a transatlantic way. You also see that in this risk management framework, where it's risk-based in the same way that the EU AI Act is risk-based. Everyone seems to...
I'm sorry, let me interrupt you, because people don't know what that means. Say what you mean by risk-based.
Yeah, that so that the obligations, if they are regulatory, the self-regulatory efforts, if they are not regulatory, will be greater, the greater the risk that there is of harm. And I think, one complication there is that sometimes, and this gets to the sort of value chain problem, sometimes the developer of an AI system may not know exactly how it's going to be deployed. And if it's deployed in a very different context from how they imagined it when they trained the model, it may be much higher risk than they thought. And so I'm not saying it's easy to determine what is the risk of a system, but risk-based basically means you have more responsibilities when it's higher risk than when, in the example of sort of a low-risk system that's usually used as like a spam filter, versus facial recognition that's going to affect someone's life opportunities would be a high-risk application. So those are the ways, but I do have to say that the EU AI Act, operates quite differently from the US regulatory structure in many ways, but I'll just raise one, which is that it is a horizontal law, right, which applies to AI systems however they're deployed, and it has a whole regulatory structure that's being developed to support that. And so far, and there have been a lot of, shout outs to the various US federal agencies that are sort of attacking some of the AI regulatory issues. So far, at least, the US has a much more vertical approach. And so they're different. Things that the question was specifically, what can we learn? How will the EU AI Act shape US approaches? We're looking very carefully. They have something called a conformity assessment, which is kind of like a, pre-release certification. So to the extent, I hope that when Senators Hawley and Blumenthal talk about licensing or certification, that they are looking at that. And they also have, the EU AI Act also has an auditing provision, as does the EU DSA. And so obviously, the American policymakers would be well advised to look at those and how they're structured.
Sarah.
I just wanted to bring in one additional point on the AI Act, which is that in addition to the sort of risk classification, there's one highest tier that it categorizes certain types of systems as unacceptable risk. And this is akin to creating bright line rules, which I know came up briefly in the conversation earlier. I think that's a really important element to keep in frame for the conversation about accountability, that, we not just have an approach that is, all systems work and are welcome, we can sort of like mitigate harm, but that there are certain types of systems, certain contexts in which systems can be deployed where the effects on the broad public may be so detrimental that they're just not, there isn't a counterbalancing reason to have them in deployment. So things in the EU AI Act that in the European Parliament version of the Act were included are predictive policing systems, social scoring systems, the deployment of facial recognition systems in public spaces, emotion recognition. I think in the US context, we haven't heard enough of those kinds of proposals being put forward where there are just like clear, strong curbs. And I think particularly given the pace at which there's, rapid deployment, the systemic effects on society, as well as the, decade or so of documented evidence on the harmful effects of some of these systems, that it's important that those kinds of proposals remain a part of the conversation that we're having around, what the public interest is in the deployment of AI systems.
There are two other international questions. I don't know if anybody wants to add to what they've already said. One is just about how U.S. companies operate internationally, and they're going to be operating according to different regulatory regimes. And also just that AI systems are innately international. And so one question is just about, should there be blanket international regulations, or what level is feasible? And somebody else specifically asked about operationalizing OECD, UNESCO, universal guidelines of AI. So I don't know if any of you want to add to what's already been said.
I guess I would just add one other piece in addition to, first of all, hard stop, yes. AI does not have boundaries to the extent that we artificially put up these boundaries by legal manifest. It's troubling, it's problematic because it's not how AI operates. It's not how people are operating anymore. It's not how companies are operating. So certainly the more there's fluidity, the more useful it'll be. But the piece that I think where there is a fluidity is when the EU acts, when they put out their draft legislation, it's not only helpful in substance, but in impact. People know that they have they will follow through. There was GDPR. People thought it was too big to happen, and we all learned if you weren't prepared for it, then it was real. And people, I think, believe the EU that they will do the hard work of constructing this regulation. And so from my work at Equal AI, there was nothing more helpful than when that draft first came out a few years ago, and companies could no longer say, well, regulation's not going to happen. I don't have to worry about it. Similarly, I happened to be in Silicon Valley the week the NTIA rule came out, and I did not have a meeting where it didn't come up. So I would say that as much as it's absolutely important, I'm so glad, Karen, you're having us drill down on the specifics of what's happening in regulation across the world. I think one thing that we're noticing is governments are stepping up. They realize that that this is a need that they cannot sidestep. That it is hard to talk about AI regulation, especially because so many people in government don't have a computer science background. They went into politics with a very different background than that which they think is necessary for AI. But fortunately on that front too, we're also learning you don't need to be a computer scientist to understand AI policy. Thank goodness. You just need to dig in and learn from the great documents out there that Rashida and others have put out there. Sarah and the other organizations are putting out there, so we can get up to speed quickly. So what I would say is, in terms of the OECD, I think we've all benefited from the tremendous work that they're doing to try and do that cross-border work. For instance, I know in the NIST definition of AI, so I mean, if we had this conversation 2 years ago, a year ago, we probably would have spent half of it on what's the definition of AI. I don't hear that anymore, and I'm so relieved because we need to get in further on what we're going to do about it. It, of course, is a really important foundational topic, so not to demean it in any way, because what are you regulating? What are you acting on if you don't have a definition? But OECD did the hard work to try and align many countries. And then NIST took that to create an AI definition that was a little more current, I would say, looking at a broader way that AI is being used currently. And so that's the definition that we used for the NIAC side of I've got my NIAC hat on now for our report in our definition of AI. So what a tremendous value to have that at our disposal so that we didn't have to spend as much time as we thought we were going to have to on that. So I will listen to others, but just to say, the fact that we've seen the sophistication, that we've seen the responsibility that government actors are taking, I think, and Rashida, you would know from your various purchases and now in the commerce side, seeing that companies understand that this is something they're going to have to be held accountable to in the regulatory space. In addition, I would say people should not forget about the litigation side that will also be coming from the civil side of the legal framework.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to give one for everybody to respond to as you wrap up. It's about the one before the wrap up is about transparency. If anyone wants to talk about that, what's the role of transparency? Who does the transparency have to be to? What are the artifacts? I think transparency was seen as a cure for some of the problems on social media, and that didn't prove to be the great fix, nor was it available. But any thoughts on the role of transparency here would be very useful.
Well, I guess one way we think about transparency, the dual way we think about transparency is it is both a tool for developers and deployers themselves reflexively to sort of, I think it was Miriam who said, what is your approach? What is your governance approach? And this is part of it. Probably more importantly, as a kind of governance tool for the world, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Transparency to whom? We heard at the Senate hearing last month, should we think about nutrition labels? Do we think about this as a direct to consumer? And I think, Karen, to your point about social media, some of those transparency efforts, and I think, Rashida, you mentioned information overload. It's a real concern. Are we thinking about system cards that go to an expert NGO community? Then we need to think about what resources they need to make sense of it, to make it actionable. Also, should transparency be continuous? Is it something that happens, at one point when a product is launched, or continuously? So I have more questions than answers, but think it's a really important piece of this whole accountability framework.
I just want to add on the point Ellen made that transparency requirements can vary by audience, and that's partially why one of the areas we're seeking guidance from policymakers is on how to fine-tune those processes. But I think transparency also needs to be balanced. In the financial sector, we use AI and other technology tools for consumer protection purposes like fraud prevention and detection. And that's an area where if you just have a bright line rule about transparency, it could actually lead to consumer harm because certain information could be made available to malicious actors to circumvent the actual intended purpose of an AI tool. So I think with any type of approach to transparency, there just needs to be really thorough thought on these different considerations, not only about audience, but also on context.
Great. We're near the end, so I wish everybody would take maybe 30 seconds. What's next? What's next in the NTIA process? What's next for your organization? What's next in the development of accountability frameworks? And Rashida, since you went last, we're going to go with you first.
Yeah, so we're planning to submit to the comments process, and it's been a very interesting process internally to think through some of those very good and tough questions that were provided. And I think, as I said up top, we really support efforts to forge global consensus around policy principles, standards, and regulatory approaches. So as a global company, we'll continue to engage on the local level, and I think we take a multifaceted approach. So we have data scientists, technologists, in addition to many different types of lawyers. So I think we'll use all of those different forms of expertise to make sure that our innovation is sort of abiding by our own data responsibility principles and maintaining a certain level of ethics.
Great. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, on the point of transparency, I think one of the key questions that we're constantly thinking through is whose ends are served by transparency, because just the knowledge that a system is being used in ways that are affecting you does not necessarily mean that you're meaningfully able to shape that effect, or even remedy it if there's just flawed and error-prone information underlying it. So I think for us, the key here is to bring that analysis of power, and particularly with the focus on the very high levels of concentration in the industry and how it's shaping the field of artificial intelligence. And that needs to be at the fore as we're thinking about accountability.
Miriam.
Thank you. Well, thank you for hosting this conversation, first of all. It's a privilege to participate. From the NIAC side of the House, we'll have a public meeting in October. So the working groups are hard at work trying to make sure that we will have as much possible to do to help support the thinking within our mandate. With Equal AI side of the Equal AI hat side of my head, I should say, we have 2 papers we're working on. We had an Equal AI badge summit. So we have a badge program for senior executives where we teach them how to do responsible AI governance, which we love. We had a summit in DC where we did a workshop on aligning on best principles and then a generative AI use case. We want to share some of that learning with the broader community. So we're right now working on a white paper to share that, as well as the second paper surveying the laws that are currently applicable today that companies need and organizations need to be thinking about as they build and deploy AI. We've got a podcast, In AI We Trust. Please reach out to us if you know people who we should be showcasing. We want to make responsible AI something everyone knows about and participates in. So we'll look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Okay, Ellen, bring us home.
Yeah, we're going to be reading every one of the more than 1,000 comments that we're expecting, and we will have a report and recommendations out in the fall.
This has been an honor to moderate this amazing panel. Thank you all for your comments. I think we will be continuing this conversation. And thank you to everybody who tuned in.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Karen. Bye.